Hello, I'm Chemistry, and this is my Capstone midterm for the project Ver build. Uh, First up is a video demo. Unfortunately, I suffered a bunch of data loss last second, but I was able to recuperate a decent amount of it. Um, so first up, I have the XR rig all set up, and I sort of have some custom handles for doing the interaction. So I use the default XR interactor for the UI because there's sort of a special method that requires its usage, but to sort of interact with the items in the real world. For example, this cube, I use a second and third raycast from each handle. Uh, so the default one sort of handles UI controls. The first of mine detects the given object and its layer. And so when you're sort of working in the zoning layer, sort of using with these basic blocks, it'll make sure to only capture these items. And then the other one is to send another ray through almost everything except for the terrain. And essentially, what that does is it allows me later on to create controls that allow me to move the block around. But instead of sending the object to a random place in the distance, it'll always place it onto the base terrain. Uh, and right now I just have a very simple flat land set up, but the terrain can apply to anything that I put into the terrain layer. Uh, yeah. For the UI, I sort of have it grouped into certain portions, and that way they're sort of angled, which is better for like viewing it in the VR position. Here we go. So as you can see, I have the UI sort of static to the player, and that way, if I did a direct overlay, it would sort of cover up a lot of the screen, especially because you already have a somewhat limited view in VR. So I made sure to make a world space UI. Then you have these basic controls down here for what I sort of call the zone mode, which is just sort of setting up the zoning. And although it's incomplete, I do have a parameter up here to change between the general scene and then what is going to be like kind of an isolated view for more specific building. Here I also have the ability to clear the UI so that you can just sort of get clear vision of what you're looking at, which will be useful later. And as well as the character controls. Right now I have it so you can sort of fly, but if you want to get more realistic simulation, there's a mode that grounds you. For the first sort of control, I just have this select tool done. Essentially, I just click on this cube here, you'll see that I can have some parameters pop up. Right now I just have name, which is cube, which you can see the directory here, which is its name. But eventually we can put in some parameters for finding the position, which is here, and then the rotation, the scale, and other details, which might be useful. And in the case that you want to change some specifications, I made sure to also have some sort of inputs on the side here. So it's almost like copying the this portion of the Unity editor into the program itself. And this is what the UI looks like in full. Essentially what I'll have in the center here is from this menu button, you'll sort of have a drop-down list of all the objects you can place into the world. And so for zoning, it'll be simple shapes like the cube before. Then I can use the other primitive shapes that Unity offers. I don't think that it's very necessary to do much fine detail editing, since it's just meant to be a sort of a generic layout for helping sort of design the scene for the user. And then of course on the side here we have the statistics, and on the other side here, once I get into it, we can change the color of blocks and certain things, and I'll just have sort of some sliders here with the RGB A values, and so we can sort of change the color and the alpha of the objects. Although I don't have that much really completed in Unity so far, I do have quite a lot of code set up, and it serves as a good foundation for adding further function. So right here in cam movement, it's sort of just for moving the character around, as well as receiving all the input from the VR headset. In previous tests, I had multiple scripts all running this sort of checker for the VR input, and what I realized was that I could simplify it and probably benefit the runtime a lot by instead just creating a variable, sort of copying the local outputs, which is sort of the method you have to use to get the input from the VR headset, and then just turning it into global static inputs. And that way, all I have to do is reference those variables in the other scripts. So here we have detection for the headset, then getting the buttons, and then sort of dividing up the joystick controls into controls that are usable for movement. So here we have that flying mode that allows you to sort of fly around the scene, then else is grounded. This is where I made the two sort of custom ray casts. Essentially, I just shoved it into a prefab, and then luckily, what I found out was that in the XR rig, one of the parameters you can have is having a model for your hands. And normally this is meant to just be a visual sort of thing, so you can, animate hands or something in the VR to match your hands in real life. Instead, what I used is a empty object with this script in it, and it just generates a raycast from the hands as the built-in XR raycast does, except this way I can really fine-tune and control what the raycasts hit. And so you see here the layer mask, I have it hitting only the UI and the terrain layer. And then this one just hits everything. And UI controls. And so I have a lot of buttons in the UI, and essentially the way to do this is to just create a function in each of these for each of these buttons, and then in Unity just add them to the onClick function here, and then just reference it from the button controller, which holds the script. And so far what I've completed is the ability to switch between scening and the scene and the build mode, then switching between like the zone and sort of like the refined model sort of mode, which also changes the UI around, and then to hide the UI, and then to control the camera. And then this is because some of the tools are exclusive, such as like resizing, rotation, whatever. This just makes sure that you're only ever selecting one. And this is sort of the visual component of it to enable and disable the buttons. And in here, I have a lot of switch case functions, and they're sort of built into each other. So the outermost layer is whether you're in the scene or if you're in the build mode. Then within that, the zone or like the refining. And then within zone, which is the first thing that I've sort of developed here, is making sure that the UI buttons all visually make sense, and then sort of bring up the menu for the objects, and then let's see, and this is for the select tool, which when you select the object, it then shows the information. Yeah. Then in edit controls, it's essentially a separated part from the UI controls, but they work hand in hand. This is the more practical portion of it, whereas the UI, I tried to make it really solely deal with the UI visuals. This sort of handles the actual function of the select tool. And now that I have the baseline down for all the switch cases and the variable names and all that, all I have to do is keep adding cases to this switch for like selecting or resizing and whatnot, and it should be good. And for that, I sort of reference a previous project in the code here. You see I have sort of a similar setup, collecting the VR input, and then here I have the sort of controls I had for resizing, rotating, and moving the objects. And this can all more or less be copied over, although I think I will have a little bit more of a traditional sort of node-based setup. And what I ran into last time was that because I was using standard Unity, if the object was large and the axis would be a fixed sort of shape or if it's a fixed size, it could be hidden inside. And so this time I made sure to use the universal render pipeline. And what that allows me to do is to stack cameras, and that way I can force certain objects in the scene to overlay others. And so what I can do is put all of those edit nodes into a layer just called edit nodes and force it to render above everything else. And that way I can sort of accomplish what I wasn't able to do in this project. Instead of sort of these finicky controls using the controller position and acceleration, I can get a lot more fine tuning. Yeah. For further planning, I've done research as to how I would do the build mode, and I know for a fact that Unity can handle making custom meshes in scripts. And what I've discovered is instead of my original plan, which was to save all of that data as like a string or like a JSON or something, instead what I can do is sort of a built-in Unity function to serialize all that data and basically save the asset as a Unity asset or a Unity prefab, and that makes storage of the objects a lot easier. It gives me a lot more freedom in terms of what's able to be done, and should lower the amount of processing that has to be done by the computer by quite a lot. So yeah, that's sort of my next step.